please join me in welcoming a real champion of our students, our professions, and our association. Please welcome NEA Executive Director John Stocks.
Don't you know, we're talking about a revolution sounds. Don't you know, we're talking about a revolution sounds like a whisper while they're standing in the welfare lines.
Tracy Chapman, I love her. Thank you, Mary, President Linguist. Vice President Reagan, thank you, Mike. John Okamoto, my colleague, thank you very much for the opportunity. The WEA Board, your executive committee, and delegates, thank you for this opportunity. Since I am the new executive director for the National Education Association, I figured I'd spend a few minutes giving you a little bit of my background, because I think it probably would interest you. I have very deep family roots in the state of Washington. My great-grandfather was a Unitarian minister in this town in the 1890s. My great-grandmother taught elocution and gymnastics in this town in the 1890s. Their church was right downtown on First Avenue. I spent my formative years and probably my most impressionable years in Washington State, arriving in 1975 to attend the Evergreen State College in Olympia to study political economy. In addition to having an absolutely wonderful education at that institution, I learned to scuba dive and catch crab in Hood Canal. I picked apples in the Okanagan Valley. I built wooden boats and sailed them through the San Juan Islands. I learned to cross-country ski at Paradise on Mount Rainier, and I learned to climb mountains on the Olympic Peninsula. During the summers, I served working as a work project leader for youth who were at risk for the Youth Conservation Corps and the Young Adult Conservation Corps for the Washington State Department of Parks and Recreation. I lived on Capitol Hill in Seattle in an apartment. It was hot that summer. I ended up sleeping out on the roof in a sleeping bag. And we would take a van down to the central area in the International District, and we would recruit unemployed young adults, and we would take them to St. Edward's State Park on the east side of Lake Washington and build trails, baseball diamonds, dormitories, hoping that we could in fact provide them with skills that they could get employment in the construction trades in Seattle. I also ran a Youth Conservation Corps program at Field Spring State Park in Annatone, Washington, which is near Clarkston. So I have really quite a lot of significant memories in this state and a lot of times that were very impressionable to me. I'm going to tell you one particular story because I learned the art and science of organizing here in Washington, and one of your own played a major part in that. I was a college student at Evergreen. I was interested in learning how to be a community organizer, and I ran across this guy named Rod Reagan. And Rod Reagan at the time was the lead organizer for an organization called the Light Brigade. And the executive director was a gentleman by the name of Dwight Pells, who's currently, I believe, the executive director, or the party chairman here. We were in Tacoma. We were organizing against the city council around a ratepayer issue. We brought a lot of people to that particular meeting that night. We had balloons and lots of fanfare and lots of demands. And we lost the vote. The Tacoma City Light voted against us. So Rod and I got in the car, and we drove up, and we got to Tukwila, and he pulled over and said, "Go into the restaurant and get me a cup of coffee." And he went into the bar next door and got himself a beer. I wasn't old enough to drink at that point in my life, so I couldn't go in the bar. And Rod said, "Find me a payphone and the Yellow Pages." So I went looking for a payphone, and I found it. And he said, "Look up the attorneys in the Yellow Pages, and then cross-reference the attorneys in the Yellow Pages in Tacoma with their home phone numbers." Now, this was about 11:30 at night. "And then get me some quarters in the restaurant." He was determined to win. And he taught me a lot that night because he got on the phone and woke up attorneys in Tacoma trying to figure out who would file a temporary restraining order against Tacoma City Light the next morning to stop their action. And by God, he found one. I tell that story because that's the kind of determination that you all are going to need to have between now and November. Because the stakes facing all of you are very high. And I know it because I experienced it quite directly in Wisconsin. I think, as Mary indicated, I went to the Wisconsin Education Association Council after I served in the Idaho State Senate. And then I went to the NEA, and on February 11th, 2011, when Governor Scott Walker introduced his legislation, I was asked by the NEA president and the international union presidents of the largest unions in the country to return to Wisconsin to help organize the uprising. That particular experience was the result of the fact that we had not done a good job in the election in 2010. And that particular election was all about electing a governor, which is what you all are faced with here in this state. And so my talk is pretty serious today because the stakes are really high, and I want to share with you what people experienced in that particular state. It started out with a piece of legislation that essentially destroyed public employee collective bargaining rights. And in the context of Wisconsin, that's a pretty significant piece of legislation because Wisconsin was the first state in the Union in the 1950s to actually pass a public employee collective bargaining law. The very first one, a very rich history of collective bargaining. The legislation also attacked our union's very existence. It was an assault directly on our right to exist. Whether or not we would have annual certification required every year to ensure that we were the representative agent for the members, the loss of agency fee, and the loss of payroll deduction. It forced our members to pay substantially more for their health insurance and their pensions. It attempted to privatize the University of Wisconsin system. It eliminated due process provisions that existed in statute as well as in contract. It was legislation that allowed contracting out of educational support staff services, and it repealed equal pay for women. This legislation was all initiated under the guise of balancing the state budget. The governor lied. He lied to everybody in the state. When he was running for governor, he said he wanted to work with the unions to balance the budget. And then when he became governor, he lied multiple times again by essentially saying that he wanted to, quote, divide and conquer the unions, both private sector and public sector in Wisconsin, when he was in a conversation with a billionaire contributor. This governor is now under a John Doe investigation, which is the equivalent of a grand jury investigation. For his aides who have been indicted while he was at the Milwaukee County Executive's office for illegal campaign activity. But probably what's most important and what I want to impart to you today and what you want to avoid at all cost is what we experienced in the winter and spring of last year in the state. And it played out on your television screens, and it was on for weeks. We ended up organizing the occupation of the Capitol. People got arrested. People got arrested. We literally had a city inside the Capitol in order to try and stop the legislature from voting on this legislation. We urged legislators to flee the state so that they couldn't have a quorum in the state Senate. We organized massive demonstrations in Madison that in some cases were over 100,000 people. We lobbied and pressured legislators back in their home communities with town hall meetings and demonstrations at their homes with picket lines. We went through one round of recall elections and were successful in recalling 2 Republican state senators. And we filed lawsuits to try and stop the action of the governor, try to stop his attack on voting rights, and a whole host of other things. We used every tactic imaginable. And then one night, about 6 o'clock, there was a notice that came across that in an hour, they were going to hold a conference committee between the 2 houses. They were going to actually extract from the legislation the portions of it that went after our union, and that they were going to pass it on the floor because it was a non-fiscal bill and it didn't require the Democrats to be there. We ran to the Capitol. The State Patrol wouldn't let us in, even though it was a publicly noticed conference committee. Finally, we convinced them to let us in because we were registered as lobbyists. And we went to the conference committee, and they ramrodded through the pulling out of the collective bargaining provisions and the other provisions of the legislation, and they went to the floor immediately with the 19 senators they had from the Republican Party. No Democrats were present. They were all in Illinois. And they voted to pass that legislation and send it on to the Assembly, where we knew that once it went to the floor, it would easily pass and that the governor would sign it. So when you all are thinking about how hard you're going to work between now and November for Jay Inslee, work as if your life and your union depended on it. Work like you have never worked before in your life in an election. Make sure that you contact everybody you know that you can persuade to support his candidacy and ensure that he gets elected. Because you do not, under any circumstances, want to go through what my fellow educators and friends have gone through in Wisconsin. They have lost so much. I go to a family gathering. My wife has 55 first cousins in Green Bay. She's Irish Catholic. And when people go to family gatherings now in Wisconsin, they're polarized. People don't talk to one another. These actions have actually destroyed relationships at the highest level of families because of his actions. It's way deeper than the politics and the policy. It's totally changed the culture of the state. And that is something that you have to avoid. So, let me tell you about the lessons that we learned and make sure that you take advantage of these lessons in what you plan to do here. Lesson number 1, build very strong coalitions with labor and other organizations in this effort. Do not try to do it alone. Employ multiple tactics in a well-thought-out strategy that includes direct action, that includes electoral action, that includes legislative action, that includes bargaining and litigation. Don't leave anything on the table. Make sure that you apply every possible tactic that you have to the problem. Know your opposition and understand their strategies and expose them. The Koch brothers just announced that they're going to spend $20 million in the recall election, which will happen in the beginning of June, of the governor. Expose Alec and Karl Rove and make sure that you talk about them with your friends and neighbors and how they are trying to take over your lives. Learn how to organize in the cyberspace. I want to commend the Washington Education Association because what you all have done with the National Organizing Institute is remarkable in sending your people. You are on the cutting edge of that work, and you need to continue to do it. Learn how to individualize, customize, and micro-target your messages to your members and the general public. People are persuaded to take action in elections for lots of different reasons, and be sure that you understand that. Chronicle your actions. Make sure that you keep track of what you do and use it to educate your members in the rank and file about how serious this fight is. Identify, recruit, train, and organize rank and file spokespeople who can actually speak on your behalf in every venue possible in every little community, because educators, education support professionals, college faculty have tremendous credentials with their peers in their own communities. 6, intentionally build your organization's capacity through every action you take. It's like a battery. Recharge it, expend the power, and recharge it again. And finally, ground all of your actions in a set of shared core values and never sacrifice them. So here's my list of core values. Equal opportunity. As an organization, bring voice to the voiceless when equal educational opportunity is threatened. Second, stand for a just society. Expose and root out social, economic, and racial injustice wherever you see it. Democracy. When people's right to vote is being threatened, mount the most vigorous defense that you possibly can to preserve their right to vote. Professionalism. Stand for the highest quality of professionalism in all of the membership categories that you represent. Partnership. Build lasting partnerships that foster mutual aid agreements on each other's issues. It's not a one-way street. It has to be a two-way street. And finally, collective action. Engage our members and partners in various forms of collective action to give them a sense of their own collective power. Those are the values that should drive every action that you take, every tactic that you use, and make sure that they are never compromised. Throughout the history of America, there have been moments where leaders were called upon to step out of the comfort zone of their everyday lives, to fight for our values, and to save our democracy from being plundered by powerful economic interests. I believe across the country, in places like Alabama and Tennessee, Wisconsin and Michigan, North Carolina, and many others, we are facing that challenge to our fundamental democratic principles in this country. It is a time when individual and collective rights are being threatened. It is a time when the sacred public trust of public education is being dismantled. It is a time when the common good is being supplanted by the interests of a powerful few. And it is a time when the very foundations of our representative democracy are in jeopardy. This is one of those times, and you are in this room because you are being called as leaders to act on these circumstances. This is a most serious moment. It is, in fact, the future, in my belief, of whether or not there will be unions in this country. It is a time that whether or not we will see public education for every student in this country. It is a time when we will see whether or not the income gap that exists in this country will ever be, in fact, closed. So, you as leaders of this great union, and you have a very great union here, the Washington Education Association, are being called on at this time to take a stand. I'm counting on you. The leadership at this table is counting on you. The NEA is counting on you. And we are all counting on you across the country to stand up for your colleagues and for the students that you teach. Thank you very much.
Crying at the doorsteps of those armies of salvation, wasting time